Okay, now that we have a document to work with, we're going to talk about navigation. When we talk about navigation, that's how we navigate the program itself, how we best use it. And I'm going to talk based on making this easiest for you. When you open InDesign, it can be quite intimidating. There's a lot to see. There's lines everywhere. There's so many tools. Keep in mind that what we typically do in the kind of design that we'll be doing in class, but also even in what you would do on a job setting, you'd be using maybe 30%, if that, of really what this program does in its whole. In my work, I will use maybe 75% when I'm working on books or doing, really kind of the heavy projects you do. So let's hope that that can minimize some of the intimidation if you're feeling it. Okay, so the first thing, we're going to go right up here to where it says Essentials. And especially for new users, the best one that I find is Essentials Classic. In fact, I still use this because I've been using InDesign since it came out. So this is just most familiar with me, and it's how I work fastest and most efficiently. However, going to Essentials Classic will bring up a lot that it may look even more intimidating now, but it actually brings up tools that are much more accessible for us. Now, if you were working in specific aspects of use, such as publishing and interactive media and so on, you can see the different workspaces that are here. Essentials is kind of an overall for the kind of work that we do. It just gives the necessary tools. So that's the first thing. Making sure you're working in Essentials Classic. Again, once you set that, it should maintain on your computer. At the schools, it defaults, and it's difficult to remember that when you start a class again and you open up InDesign, you have to switch to that. However, it is the best one. I'm just going to close a couple things. So notice how I close a panel. I just hit those double arrows there. And I like to keep as tidy a screen as I can. I have my Pages panel open, which we'll talk about in a bit. And I keep everything usually at the right here. Try not to have windows, out over your document. Sometimes I'm working with students and they're working on a document. Meanwhile, they've got all these panels all over. And that's not helpful. You don't want to have to keep moving them around. So you just want to figure out for yourself what the best arrangement is. And, there can be several that you're working with at once. However, you just want to keep them out of the way, and you'll be able to access them quite easily when you need to. And I'll show you that in a moment. So, you're working in Essentials Classic. I'm going to go right over here to our cursors. Now, one of the best ways to work with the programs we do is to form habits. In our document setup, we talked about forming, the habit of saving frequently, Command S, or going to File Save often, and after anything you do, going to save. That may be a habit many of you already have just from working in other programs you use already. However, here again, you can do 20 minutes worth of work, and if you don't save and your computer crashes or the power goes out, you can lose quite a bit very quickly. So another habit as far as navigation goes is defaulting back every time you do something, defaulting back to this cursor, which is called the selection tool. If I hover over it, you'll see the selection tool note there. that V that you see is indicating that you can press V to get that tool. Or escape. Escape sometimes doesn't work depending on the preferences of the specific computer you're working on. Now, the reason I say default back to that is because in this program, it's very easy to have been working with a tool, and then when you're done working with it, hanging on to it, and you can inadvertently do something with that tool that you may not even notice. And I'll give you an example in a bit. So for myself, it's so habitual that even when I know I'm selected on it, I can see there it's selected, I go to it anyway and I click. And it's just because it's such a habit that I make sure I'm defaulting back to that tool. That's kind of the equivalent of letting go of everything and moving on. So again, if I draw a square, and then I'll just go here. And that's me letting go of that shape tool that I had just used. And then if I click off, which is into this kind of dead area of the page, I'm deselecting everything on the page. So often in class when I'm walking around and helping students and they have a question, one of the first things I'll say is click off. It's not an insult. It's just me saying, just click off, deselect everything, make sure that you're on your main cursor or the selection tool. I often refer to it as the main cursor. And that way you're ready to proceed. So making that a habit, it's a small thing that is so helpful and so important with a program like this. And that same habit carries on into both Illustrator and Photoshop as well. Now, using the selection tool, you can click on an item, you can click and drag across it. It is strictly the selection tool. It will select something, not a part of something. If it's a group of items, it'll select all of them. I'm just going to delete this for now. Okay, so that's our first habit, the first part of navigation. We're going to talk about this tool down the road, the direct select. And one thing I want to say, I do not go through this program and say this tool does this tool does this tool does this. That's useless. It's not going to help us at all, especially when we don't use many of these tools typically. So we're going to try and form that habit, but we're going to move on to another aspect of navigation. So you have your selection tool, and then moving things around. Now, you may be used to using the scroll on your mouse, just doing that, even if you have one that does left, right. That's fine, but that is still maintaining some rigidity. That's the program saying you only get to move up and down, left and right. Same with the scroll bars. Now, I don't typically use the scroll bars in the Adobe programs because they have a great tool where if you hold the space bar down, so I'm holding it down with my left thumb and my right hand is on the mouse. If you hold the space bar, you'll see that hand. That hand is over here as a tool, but you don't want to necessarily have to click on it. So I just hold it down with my thumb, hold, and I'll click and drag, and I can move the page around. Now, while we don't have anything on the page, it's hard to see the value in that. But when you're zoomed in on something, and then you hold the space bar down and just gently move it, and you're using your mouse, this becomes extremely useful to navigating your document, but working fluidly versus using the scroll bars and using the zoom key and trying to zoom in. I'll talk about zooming in a moment. So really try and get in that habit, using your thumb or your forefinger to hold the space bar, click and drag. And just try that. Just hold the space bar down, click and drag. That is a fantastic way to control the program, keeping it from controlling you, and to move things about. Okay? And you're using that to focus in on something, to narrow in on part of your program. or part of your layout. Okay, so now you may have gotten, it somewhere, and you want to get it back to kind of that reset your page. So we're going to do Command 0. Now Command 0 zeroes in, if you can use that to remember it. Command 0 zeroes in on that area of your screen, strictly on the page. So kind of that default position for the page. So if I zoom in and I'm done, I'm using my spacebar to move it around, and I want to get back to that reset my page, Command 0, and that'll bring it right back. Now that is also in the view, fit page in window. I call it reset the page from an old program I used to use. But you're essentially just trying to get it so that you see everything on the page. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick review here. We're at Essentials Classic. So that's your workspace. You've set it to Essentials Classic. You're trying to form the habit of anytime you're not using a specific tool, you're on the main cursor or the selection tool. You're using the spacebar by holding it down, clicking and dragging to move about, and you're doing Command 0 to reset your page. Now, zooming in and out. There are, as with other programs, many ways you can zoom in and out. You can see the tool here. I never use that. And I'm going to hope that you are able to avoid using that as well, because it's another click and grabbing the tool, and then another click to let it go, and so on. So the best way to zoom in and out on the Adobe programs, and it takes a little bit of getting used to. You have to use your dexterity with these keyboards, but you will quickly get used to it. Like I said earlier, my left hand is typically always in the bottom left of the keyboard, and my right hand on the mouse. And if I do space command, so I'm holding space and command down right now, I can click and drag. I can just keep clicking, and I'm going to reset the page, Command 0. I can do space command option, and that will be zoom out. And I'll reset the page again. So let me go over that a little slower. So space, holding space down, and then add command into that. So forefinger and then my second finger. Click or click and drag, and then space command option will let me zoom out. Now, in class, I have a little fun by telling you guys how I teach this to a summer camp to very young kids, like 7-year-olds that are using InDesign. I'm trying to teach them ways to use the hotkeys, so the space command. So if you ever need to think of a fun way to zoom in and out, space command zoom. So I yell it in a fun way, but I'm not going to do that now. But it's fun to hear a bunch of kids yelling space command zoom. So space command zoom, and then space command option, not as fun, to zoom out. Okay, so I really encourage you to try and use the keys and the mouse that way. Of course, you can use command plus and minus, but again, you're working within the rigidity of the program. Command plus and minus simply zooms in from center screen no matter where you are. But if you have something on the screen and you're trying to specifically zoom in on that something, then space command, you can zoom right in, space bar to move over, and you can get very centered on what you're trying to work on. Okay, so command 0 again to reset the page. I'm just going to delete that. There I am clicking on my main cursor, even though I was already on it, but that's my habit. And if I was working here, I would be doing command S frequently, trying to save. Now, another aspect of navigation, the final one we're going to talk about at the moment, actually not the final, we have one more, is when we have things on the page like this. Let me just put a few things on here just so we have a point of reference. So I've got objects here, and these objects have a black border on them, no fill. We'll talk about that in tutorials ahead of color and so on. However, we can see these little blue lines, and that is not color. That is actually what's called a frame. So when we see the frame like that, that is something that can be distracting, right? If we get several items on the page and we've got all our guides here, and I'm going to talk about these guides shortly, just based on our previous tutorial. We want to get a clean look at our document, even if we have some text up here. You know, that says test, but that's okay. That has a frame as well. So we got all this stuff. We just want to see what this is going to look like. One of the great things in this program is the presentation mode we can go into. Now again, this is in the view menu, and in fact I never go here, so I have to, there we go. So presentation, Shift W. Well, if you actually just do W, it will get rid of everything. Now this is what we call presentation mode. You do not want to work in presentation mode. You want to work in this, which is what we call working mode, so that you are seeing everything. So the reason that we just press the W, and I'm just pressing the W key, is so that you can see what everything looks like without those frames around it. Now, there's a couple things to be careful of. I'm going to press W again here. If I was live in type, see my cursor is blinking there, and I'm in the type. If I was live in that, it's going to make that an X, and I want to see this in presentation mode, I would end up putting a W in there. So you have to be out of your text, your live text, and that's a good reason to go back to your default, to your selection tool, and click off to make sure that when you press W, you're not going to be affecting anything. Now it seems kind of obvious that you catch it, but if you're working on a document where you had to do an edit in a small paragraph, and then you press W to get presentation mode, you've just added a W accidentally into your text. And then you realize it, you go back to your selection tool, and you may have completely forgot that you just added a W into that text. And now you have a typo or an error in your copy. So it's a very handy thing, pressing W. You just have to do it at the right times. Now this is where one of the errors that commonly happens with new users, and I check this when I'm marking files all the time, especially the first project. This is where I see it the most. But sometimes students will work in presentation mode, and you know, things are still going to work, but you're not going to see a lot happening. So let's say I use my type tool, and I have to click and drag to make a frame there. So I write a word, and then I'm done. So I've written that word, I'm still on my type tool, and then I go and I want to move this. I want to start moving things around. So I go to move that. I can't grab it, so I'm just going to try and move this. And things just, why can't I grab those? So I need to go get my main selection tool and start moving things around. But what I started doing there, because I was using a tool, that I shouldn't have been using, I didn't let it go after I used it, I ended up, I'm going to press W here, drawing a bunch of invisible text frames. So it is very common, and understandably, that I'll often look at projects, the first project, and I'll find all these invisible text frames. Or eventually you're going to run into something not working, and it's because you have a text frame that's affecting the things it's above, below, or beside, and so on. The text frames can have different characteristics applied to it that affects things around it, and you may not even see it. So that's another reason to really make it a habit to switching back to your main cursor, so that you're entirely letting go of that previous tool and you're not inadvertently causing yourself trouble with other items. So I'm just going to select these things and get rid of those. Okay, so the final part of navigation is the Pages panel. Now, we don't have to worry too much about this in our case because we don't have multi-page documents, but the Pages is where we navigate our document. So if I had a document that had, several pages, I just added a bunch there in the panel by pressing the plus key. You don't have to do that. I would use the Pages panel to jump from page to page. I'm right now showing page 3, even though we didn't see anything change there. Had I content throughout, if I had content throughout, then we would have seen. So the Pages panel typically is how you navigate a document that has a lot of pages. However, I can also use, going back to holding the space bar down, clicking and dragging, I can use that to scroll through my document as well. Okay, so navigation is something that you want to use very fluidly. Again, it's all about you controlling the program and not letting it control you. One final thing before I stop this segment. This is our page. We made that page document, that document setup, and this came out to be our page. Remember, we set the bleed at 0.125 inches. I'm going to talk a bit about that. Bleed is where we come off the page here. So this red is the bleed guide. And a good way to remember what that guide is red and bleed. I'll leave it at that. But the bleed guide is red, and it is going 1/8 of an inch, or 0.125 if you make that fraction decimal, off of the page. This pink margin is pink guide is the margin. So we had 1/2 inch margins, 1/2 inch from the edge of the page. The page is whatever we're seeing in white. So we have our bleed guide, our page edge, and our margin. Again, the margin is not confining. It's not, you don't have to work within the margin. However, we use the margin because it's, design-wise, a good safety reference, a good reference for where we should put content, typed content specifically. So if I had content there, this is usually a little too close to the edge. Optically, it can be a little uncomfortable, and production-wise, we want to stay away from the edge. Usually these days we can get quite close to the edge and we're not going to get any clipping if this went into a print and cut situation. However, optically is really where a 1/2 inch feels comfortable with most type. So you can see we can work in any way over the margin. It is just a frame of reference, and we'll talk about that in future tutorials as well. Just know that it's not confining your work to that space within the margin. Now the bleed guide, I'm just going to draw a rectangle here. and make it black with a fill. So we'll talk about this in our lecture, in our class. However, I'm just going to show you, whenever you have something that you want to appear at the page edge, so I'm going to make this like just a header at the top of the page. Whenever you want something that, were we to print it, were we to go to print with this, we would want it to print so that there's no border. It's at the page edge. And this is very common. Usually we want to bleed things off, imagery, color blocks, and so on, because it makes the page flow to the outside and we're not confined in a margined environment. That's just a good design practice, and that will come up more in classes ahead. So when we want something to land at the page edge that way, the reason we have the bleed is so that when something gets printed and trimmed, the possibility of the cut being off won't leave a white line. You know, if this cut was shifted a bit, when this went into a print and cut process, it got printed on a big roll of paper and it got trimmed and the paper moved, we don't end up with a white edge. So what we're essentially doing with bleed is we're saying we're giving it more than it needs, more ink, more coverage than it needs off that page. Because when things get printed in a proper production process, they don't just get printed one page at a time, they get printed on a giant roll and a large piece of paper, and then they get cut. Each piece, each flyer, each letterhead, whatever it is, gets cut from that large piece of paper. So this part that goes out of our page edge, that goes to the bleed guide, this would just be scrap. However, again, if that trim was off a bit, we wouldn't have a white edge, a white line. We would have a nice clean printed edge. Whereas if something was off and we didn't bleed, we could end up with something like that wouldn't look good.